You're watching BreakThru News.
I'm Charlotte Thun-Hohenstein, and you're watching BreakThru News on BTR Today. Today we're talking about the so-called crisis in America's elite education, and with me in the studio is Bill Deresiewicz, a former Yale professor for 10 years, author of the book Excellent Sheep, which just came out, and I have it right here. Recommend. This is the very book. A book which is expanding on his ideas, which came out 6 years ago in the American Scholar, a rather incendiary article, Bill, called The Disadvantages of an Elite Education. So thank you so much, Bill, for coming in today.
Thanks for having me on.
I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I have been for a while because my alma mater was Yale, and I graduated in 2012. So I think we just missed each other.
That's right. I left in 2008.
But it was a really, really interesting read, and definitely a lot resonated, a lot was quite disturbing, and certainly all of it was thought-provoking.
Good.
So
thank you.
So it was very stimulating. But just I'll begin by summarizing my own understanding of it, which was that elite liberal arts education in the US should really be achieving two missions, one on the individual level and one on the social level. And on the individual level, it's very much to nourish the life of the mind of its students. And on the social level, you want to be preparing them to serve in society, not necessarily as leaders, in the conventional sense, but even just as citizens.
Yes.
So actually, I wanted to start off by just asking you if you thought that one of these missions was more important than the other.
No, in fact, I think they are absolutely synergistic. Preparing people to be productive members of society, whether we want to call that leaders or citizens or citizen leaders or whatever, absolutely requires a certain amount of self-development, not in a narcissistic sense, but in a sense of becoming someone who can respond as a whole individual to the situations they face, rather than merely a highly specialized professional, which tends to be what the training produces now.
Well, so let's talk about the individual side of things. Okay. And certainly the way you describe it in the book, it sets the stakes very high. I mean, you use the phrase at one point, like, nothing short of the ability to remain fully human.
Yes.
Yes. And you talk about it in the sense of almost finding the meaning of life.
Yes, why not?
Or like one's purpose, and which would be awesome.
Yes.
If everyone did that. Of course, you could respond saying, of course, it's a lifelong journey working out these big questions. So why, in your view, is it important really to tackle this as much as possible at college?
Well, so let me say. And when I talk about the meaning of life, I say, that sounds very abstract. I'm really talking about the meaning of your life, which some people call purpose. I try to avoid the word passion, but they're all getting at the same thing, which is an inner sense of direction and meaningfulness. And I'm careful to say in the book that this is not that this is a lifelong process, but that if it hasn't started by the time you finish college, it's going to be much, much harder to start it after that. College is, first of all, specifically set aside as 4 years where you can begin to do that. And second of all, for most people, if you go straight out of high school or take a gap year, it's coming at precisely the time, the beginning of young adulthood, when people are most apt to ask these kinds of questions. And for us to now have a system that really doesn't give you that opportunity, and in some ways suppresses it, inhibits it, is a huge misfortune.
So why, because obviously you think that, our system is failing this ideal. Why do you think that liberal arts education is particularly well situated, ideally, to actually achieve this?
Right. The rubric I use is not so much liberal arts education as the problem. I'm talking about the system of elite education or selective education. And a big part of the problem to me is precisely that it's getting away from the old notion of a liberal arts education. That's what a liberal arts education has traditionally been understood to be. I mean, going back really centuries, that it's about what used to be called the formation of character. I think that's too archaic a phrase for me to use, but really we mean the same thing. And you can also just say becoming an adult. And it has evolved in the direction, I think especially at elite private universities, of a very sophisticated form of vocational training or technocratic training.
Do you think that everyone ideally should get this form of liberal arts education if possible?
Not only do I think that, but that has been thought for. That is not
by
just
lots
my
of people.
thought, by lots of people. I mean, look, not everyone is going to go to college. Maybe not everyone should. I certainly don't think everyone should feel that they have to. But if you're going anyway, and almost all higher status, more intelligent, ambitious people, young people do. I mean, my premise is you're going to be there anyway. We could debate about whether that's absolutely necessary, but leaving that aside, you're going to be there anyway. You should do this. And yes, everybody, from the Ivy League down to community colleges. And that was once our ideal in this country.
Wow.
The whole expansion of public, I know people think that this is like a 19th century gentleman's education, or they think this is just the 60s. Two concepts which are, of course, completely contradictory, right? In fact, there's a continuity of the commitment to liberal arts education. And as we expanded public higher ed, starting in the Civil War, that notion was central to it and continued to be really until the rise of neoliberalism, Reaganism, whatever you want to call it, in the 70s and 80s, when suddenly it became, we have time for nothing except preparing you for your first job, whether that's going to be at Goldman Sachs because you went to Harvard, or in a doctor's office because you went to a branch campus of a state university and studied to be a physician's assistant or whatever. That's the idea that's new.
So let's talk a bit about the admissions process, because it seems,
Sure.
Can you elaborate on
Sure.
how this is playing into this problem?
Right, because I think it's central. It's central
Right.
to the production of what the title of my book, quoting a former student of mine, called Excellent Sheep. The admissions process, as it has evolved, especially in selective colleges, produces people who are fantastic hoop jumpers, who know they have to do a million different things, none of which they have an opportunity to really invest themselves in, any given one of which they really can't invest themselves in because they have so many other things they need to do, the 12 extracurriculars and the 7 AP courses, service, leadership, musical instruments, sports. I'm running out of breath just listing them, right? No time to sleep. This is what the system has demanded now. And this, to me, is the essential problem, is the admissions process and the person it creates by the time you get to college,
Right.
and then the failure of college to really interrupt the momentum of that.
I completely agree with, I mean, even just witnessing my own younger siblings, and even just over the course of those few years since I was going through this process, how it's even become more ratcheted up in terms of the expectations.
Yes, all the time.
I completely see that. I just wonder if it's possible to actually lay blame on individuals for this, as opposed to it's just very scary. It's almost more scary that I think it's just this like horrible organic place that we've arrived
I
at,
absolutely
because I don't
agree.
really know how you back down from the situation, because it is so competitive. Decisions are just going to become more arbitrary if you try and not take a lot of things into account. No?
Oh, how could they
you
possibly
how you-
change the admissions process?
Right, exactly. Like even if college, yeah.
But this is the only way we can do it? No.
Okay.
Look, there are many possibilities. We could have colleges say you can't list more than 3 extracurriculars. We could have colleges value, I know that this isn't easy and it might require expanding admissions office staff, but after all, they're making very important decisions and they need to get them right. We measure students on GPA. That encourages perfectionism. It encourages a kind of glib sort of checklist, box checking. A lot of the students that I think are most interesting and often go to liberal arts colleges rather than Ivy League universities are the kind who say, I don't care about getting an A in everything because I really care about 1 or 2 things. They're just as smart. They're often more interesting and more intellectually engaged. How do we encourage more of that? How do we encourage, instead of leadership, real moral fiber, which often means resistance to a system, real independence and real curiosity? I'm not saying this is, I think the policies may be hard to figure out, but I think the goals should not be that hard to figure out.
Do you think, I mean, because you've been within the admissions process,
a little bit.
You've seen it.
I got to
you've
see it from the inside.
it.
Yes, I've glimpsed it. Yeah.
Did you get the feeling that the people working there were all aware of this problem and just trying to do the best that they could, or did you get the sense that they were like relishing this overabundance of applicants?
No, I think that they were definitely trying to do best they could. I really felt that they were coming from a real place. I don't think that they saw the problems with the system as such. I think what they had a problem with is all the exceptions that we make. They had a problem with admitting the hockey player above the valedictorian.
Okay.
Or the rich kid's son, the rich kid just because father and mother are giving so much money. That
Right.
really bothered them. But I don't actually think they were as clued into the problems with the system. They're looking for like PQs, personal qualities, good kids, well-rounded kids, but their conception of that starts with a bar that's raised so high that it's really sort of the most personable of the sheep, the most attractive of the sheep, instead of trying to find a completely different species or perhaps a whole menagerie of species.
Mm. And you'd think that there are enough people in the student body that you'd be able to do that if
Right,
you
but
wanted
again,
to.
I mean, the numbers is the bar that you have to clear. The GPA, SAT, the first thing that struck me was that kids who had 6 or 7 extracurriculars were already, I mean, it was quite clear they're going to be admitted because that wasn't nearly enough.
I hope my younger siblings are watching this. Or not, actually.
There was one kid who had so many extracurriculars and 8 or 9 letters of recommendation, which is like 6 or 7 more than you need, that like, no, this person is too intense.
Oh my God.
You know, but
wow.
That was one out of, the 100 that we looked at that day.
So let's just circle back a bit because they are two separate problems. One is the admissions process conditioning you to be the kind of person who then can't step out of that box. But then you're saying that the university experience then sort of solidifies that mentality further, as opposed to you've jumped through all these hoops, you've managed to like scrape your way into a good school.
Right.
And now you can relax.
Right.
That's impossible.
Well, I mean, it's not impossible, but I don't see it happening very often. It's really sad because more than once I've come across a student like late high school or very early college who says, now that I'm going to college, now that I've gotten into Princeton or Yale, now I can start to have the real educational experience. And they tend to be disillusioned very quickly. But really, it's their own doing at that point because they don't have to participate in the mad frenzy of student extracurricular life, which goes on in these schools, I think just as a matter of momentum. I mean, you're so used to accumulating credentials and building your resume and trying to do everything you possibly can that you just don't stop. And I think it becomes competitive in the sense that, the other kid is going to get the job that I want or the law school admission that I want. That's the positive part of this book, is that I think if you want to, you can step outside of the system.
That's what I was going to suggest next was, okay, so we're aware of all these shortcomings. Why not still, if you end up getting into one of these schools, go and just try and be extra aware, and not fall into the traps, and take advantage of all the resources that are available to you that come with these larger schools,
Right. Well, okay, yes. I mean, if you're already at one of these schools, that's my recommendation. Try to step outside. You're going to have to fight the system in a lot of ways. That's what people have always said. But your premise is, what if you've already gotten to one of these schools? Well, wait a second. Who have you had to become to do that? Also, are these the only alternatives? Why must you go to an Ivy League school? There are a lot of great schools. I think liberal arts colleges are wonderful institutions. There are also public liberal arts colleges that are called honors colleges. Now, you just sort of raised your eyebrows, like who would not go to the Ivy League?
Did I raise my eyebrows?
Yes.
Oh, God.
Who would not go to the Ivy League if given the chance?
Oh, God.
So why would one go to the Ivy League if one was given the chance?
It's not, okay. I'm just saying, even from a purely objective point of view, if you can play the competitive game but somehow maintain like an inner sanctity of your own intellectual journey at the same time. How do you do both?
So I guess that's the, I mean, want to do both of those?
To just give yourself options, But I mean, I guess, you do end up continually falling back into this trap of being able to climb a ladder if you want to then climb that ladder,
Yeah,
I suppose.
I mean, I really think that the system forces you to choose between learning and success. And I'm very clear. I mean, people say to me, well, can I do both? And I'm like, well, are you really trying to do both? Or are you just rolling with the dice with your fingers crossed? Are you really just trying to have it both ways? Yeah.
I mean, I do feel a sort of obligation to say here that I guess very luckily found some wonderful professors who offered wonderful, thoughtful guidance.
Yes.
And certainly have a lot of friends who also had this experience, but I can also say that I would also see people who didn't manage to find that.
Yes.
Now, whether or not that's because they weren't looking for it enough, or whether, the system didn't make it available enough to them, I guess that is the the question.
I think it's both. I think it's both. But again, I mean, I've really heard this consistently from the people who felt they got a good education at one of these top schools. You can do it if you try hard enough, if you fight the system. And what I'd like to point out is that there are schools, including schools that are full of really smart kids, where you don't have to fight and you don't have to be the exception. And those schools are called liberal arts colleges. One of the big issues, you mentioned professors, one of the things that's going to help you fight the system is to have professors who are passionate about teaching and passionate about mentoring. Every incentive for professors at research universities is for them to spend as little time on their teaching and with their students as possible and as much time on their research. And one of the things that's better about the colleges, the liberal arts colleges, is that the incentives are a little different and there's much more encouragement in teaching and being part of the undergraduate community. Yeah.
Well,
they're very different, culturally they're very different places.
Yeah. Well, we are going to take a very quick break for this excerpt from the latest episode of Live Studio featuring the Donkeys, but we will be right back in a moment.
Drop me off on the bottom of the ocean, leave me here, I got my potion. Underwater votes creature, don't you eat my amphibious teacher. Starfish wrapped around my face.
We're back with Bill Deresiewicz and our conversation on the crisis in American higher education and the elite system of education. So, Bill, before we were talking a lot about the individual journey, let's talk more about on the social level of things and the role, the role that these colleges are playing. First of all, why is it so? I mean, this is probably kind of an obvious question, but I may as well ask it. Like, why is this a problem for society at large? Like, why not just say, you know what, let these miserable people, you know, fight their way to get into this, to those colleges and then go and work in finance? Like, why does it matter?
Right, because those people end up running the country. The ones who go into finance run our banks. The ones who go into government run our governments. I mean, this has been a big trend. There's an increasingly narrow set of institutions that's producing an increasingly large proportion of our leadership class. You can look at our recent presidential nominees, Supreme Court, all the way down CEOs. So 50 years ago, we put this meritocracy into place, and it was a great thing. It opened up opportunity. But increasingly, it's creating this kind of profile of the excellent sheep. And so for about the last 30 years, since that original cohort got to positions of adult responsibility, we've had a leadership class, an elite, that's their adult excellent sheep. And I think they display all the characteristics of they're self-serving, they're self-congratulatory, they're entitled, they're self-enclosed, they tend to be timid and lack real courage and imagination and real leadership qualities. And I think there ought to be a general consensus that at least in the last 10, 12, 15 years, we've seen a comprehensive failure of our leadership class right across all of our institutions. So whether you're part of the system or not, it matters to you. That this is the last section of my book, and why the beginning of the subtitle is The Miseducation of the American Elite. Yeah.
Well, and I guess the crucial point is to link that back to the idea that that individual journey of exploration will make you a more thoughtful leader, because you could take it in a different direction and say, well, there's a tension there, because if you're not along this sort of open-minded questioning of everything around you, what if you actually never get to that point of wanting to serve society or caring about anyone else, you know?
Well, look, but I think
self-knowledge at all costs, you know.
Well, I understand. I understand.
You
that
know,
line
like
of
you
argument,
could take
but
it, and like I'm sure some people do end up in that situation.
But I don't actually think that's how it works. I mean, yes, it may lead into solitary introspection for a lifetime.
Or just disregard for society as some artificial, cobbling together of norms.
Because this is not an abstract intellectual issue. Here's the thing. I think the system as it exists now, despite its rhetoric of service and giving back and leadership, actually produces people who precisely are not doing any of those things, who claim to be leaders but are really just serving themselves. I think, in fact, leadership, which has become the most popular word on campuses,
yes,
charitably speaking, it means nothing in the way that it's used. To be more honest, it means being in charge, getting to the top. I've talked to students at a variety of colleges about leadership because they're all really invested in the word. And they either can't tell me what it means at all the things that come out with are somehow about the individual. Well, it means power, it means wealth. Never once does anybody say it means being of service, honor,
okay, that
duty,
actually
responsibility,
surprises me,
putting others first. Whereas I think the path that begins with introspection leads very quickly to a feeling of connection to others and responsibility towards others.
Okay.
Because that's what's inside us. But if you're always just projecting your will outward and taking your cues from what's around you, which is what the system inculcates now, I think you never really do develop. And I think we see this among our leaders. I really do.
So I guess my next question is, do you think there's a place for an elite system of education at all in a democracy? Like, is your problem with the existence of any elite system, or just the fact that our elite are failing us, or both?
Right, that's a good question. That's a good question. I'm not so sure I know the answer to that. I think at the very least,
it seems like at the crux.
At the very least,
we problem.
Yes, I know. I think at the very least we need to reform our leadership class. But my ultimate argument in the book is that we need to create a situation in which the Ivy Leagues don't matter that much anymore. We have outsourced the creation of our leadership class to 10 or 12 private institutions who will have a very limited number of spaces and will always put their own interests first. What we need to do is to rebuild our great public universities. We did that. I mean, we spent a century in this country building a huge and remarkable system of public higher ed. And we've been systematically defunding it for the last 30 years. Like, we defund our roads and bridges and scientific research and many forms of public good. And if we rebuilt those, if we had, China's slogan is 100 Harvards. I want 100 Berkeleys. I want not 10,000 spaces that everyone's scrambling for each year, but 200,000 or 300,000. Unquestionably, some will rise to the top. But at the very least, that filtering won't have happened by the time you're 18. And more people will have a chance, and it will be, because the scramble will be less intense for those limited number of spaces. I think the admissions madness can finally, sort of be drained of its energy.
Isn't some of this slightly beyond any national level of control, in the sense that these universities have these global brands now, and so even if the US invests, in rebuilding locally, the rest of the world is still going to be pummeling to get into.
Well, let the rest of the world produce. They are. Look, Anglo-American higher ed is an incredibly prestigious global brand right now. It's like Oxford, Cambridge, and then 10 or 12 American schools that all the rising elites, East Asia, South Asia, Brazil. I mean, I've talked to people from all of those places. They all want to get into these schools. Let that be their problem. Let them produce excellent sheep among their leaders, and let us go back to stronger notions of democracy, of citizenship, of real access, of equal access. That's part of the crisis. We are wasting so much of our talent because so many talented kids don't have a shot. I mean, right from the beginning, because K through 12 funding is ridiculously unequal in this country. So effectively, 90% of kids are shut out from access to these schools.
What about all the radical financial aid packages that a lot of these schools have started? I mean, I feel like you immediately just hold that up and be like, they're trying.
Everybody always does. Well, let's say several things about it. One, they're trying harder lately because Senator Charles Grassley threatened to take away their nonprofit status. Two, the percentage of really disadvantaged kids they admit is still extremely small. 3% from the bottom quarter of the entire income distribution, 75% from the top quarter. Harvard gives financial aid to about 60% of kids. Sounds great. Most of those kids are upper middle class because these schools are so expensive that even doctors and lawyers need help paying for them. So there's still extreme socioeconomic stratification, despite the fact that the colleges are trying, but they're only ever going to go so far because they need a solid tuition base. It's part of their budgetary model, which public universities, if they had a real tax base behind them, wouldn't need. That's the point. And it's what we used to do. You know that the UC system was tuition free until the early 1980s.
I did not know that.
And
was that in the book?
Yeah, it is.
Was it?
I don't think I said the early 1980s.
Oh, okay.
Yes,
I was like, I read the
free.
book cover to cover.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, we're going to have to wrap up very soon, but I just want to finish. Let's talk a little bit more about the corporate nature of these places, because that is it also seems to be very much at the crux of the problem.
I have a lot to add beyond what I just said, which is that they're private institutions that always have to look at their own financial interests first. But I will say that I think it's related to the fact that these institutions have from time to time assumed real social leadership in the real sense, which means they've taken risks because they saw that there were larger ideals that needed to be promoted.
Well, I mean, you would point to the 60s?
Well, the whole shift to meritocracy, right, started, I mean, if you really started at Harvard in the 30s and was consummated by Yale in the 60s, but it was, at a significant amount of caution to Yale, by the way. It was real courage, it was real imagination, it was real leadership, and it was seen, and it happened because these old WASP aristocrats, or enough of them anyway, saw that they needed to put the interests of the country ahead of the interests of their own class, and needed to give access to these rising groups, Jews and people of color and women, right? These were all boys, all male institutions. They did that once, and some of those presidents were real national figures, like Kingman Brewster at Yale, or Clark Kerr at the University of California. I haven't seen that in a long time. I think they're very reactive, they're very passive, they tend to respond to economic pressures and never fight back. They tend to see their students as customers and not as students. I'm not saying this is easy, but important things are never easy.
I'm sure you're going to offend a lot of people with this book.
I wouldn't be happy with myself if I didn't.
Okay. Well, we're gonna have to wrap
yes,
up.
There's a lot more to say about this.
There's a lot more to say. I guess I will just finish by saying I really hope that the book is a force for positive change.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Bill, for joining me today. We'll be right back in a moment after this quick excerpt from a bonus edition of BTR Live Studio this week on BreakThruRadio.com featuring Spirit System.
Lower down to the ground. When your tears are all been emptied, and it's true, I was not around. How was I to know?
Thank you everyone for tuning in. I'm Charlotte Thun-Hohenstein, and this is BreakThru News, your window into today. Be sure to check out BreakThruRadio.com through the weekend for the rest of our Cooking Week coverage, including our Taste Talk event in Brooklyn last weekend that will be coming to Chicago October 3rd through the 5th. That's it for what's breaking through the news today. Tell us what's breaking through your world on Twitter @BreakThruRadio. I'm Charlotte Thun-Hohenstein, and thank you for joining us.